Hey guys, tonight we begin with something very relatable, sleep. Or more accurately, how medieval people slept, which turns out to be far weirder than most of us could imagine. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before electricity, TikTok, and sleep hygiene influencers, medieval people approached nighttime with a schedule that would baffle the modern melatonin enthusiast. It was called segmented sleep, a natural two-part sleep cycle split neatly in half like a stale medieval biscuit. Then several hours later, they'd wake up on purpose, not alarmed or anxious, but simply because that was the rhythm of the night. After sunset, most people went to bed early, slipping into what was called first sleep. This quiet middle period, gently separating the two halves of their rest, wasn't viewed as sleeplessness. It was expected. So if you find yourself awake at 2 a.m., maybe don't worry. But in the medieval world, waking up at midnight wasn't strange. It was simply how things were. Everyone followed the same soft rhythm, drifting in and out of the dark together. If the family could afford it, the mattress might be lifted onto a wooden frame, which helped keep the bugs away, if only a little. Just take a breath, stretch a little, and whisper. Ah yes, beds were so treasured. They were passed down in wills, a true family heirloom. Entire families, sometimes even extended ones, curled up close together for warmth. If you got too hot, you rolled away. Homes were cold, and the heat of your body, especially from your head, slipped away easily. If someone snored, you just waited for the rhythm to return. It was about getting through the night, staying warm, staying still, and maybe dreaming of one day sleeping on something quiet and soft. The watch has begun. You might share space with strangers in an inn, shoulder to shoulder, dreaming beside someone you didn't know. Inns might try to group guests by profession, but often it was simply lie where there's room. Even a crowded bed felt like safety. Privacy wasn't expected. If a bed had room, you joined. If you were lucky, they didn't snore. If someone answered the door wearing one, it was a gentle way of saying, I'm done for the day. Please, not now. It was a time for peaceful tasks, whispering prayers, tending to the hearth, checking on animals, or simply reflecting in silence. For women, a cap might also be a wrap, keeping hair in place and modesty intact. In some places, it was even expected that a married woman cover her head at all times, day or night. Sometimes it was a time for intimacy, with medieval guides even noting that this brief, waking window was ideal for connection, as both the body and mind were rested and calm. Eventually, the second sleep would arrive naturally, carrying people back into slumber until the first light of day. Warm, soft, and occasionally flammable, the kind of clothing meant for drifting, not impressing. From monks to farmers to poets like Chaucer, this nightly pattern was so common that even literature treated it as ordinary. Today, researchers suggest that this split pattern might be closer to how our bodies naturally rest, especially without artificial light keeping us up. It wasn't until factories, gas lights, and the pressure of productivity that the idea of 8 uninterrupted hours took hold. Sleep as a contest, timed and optimized. Forget memory foam and cooling gels. For many, a bed was a sack of straw or hay on a wooden floor, possibly a little damp, and sometimes already warmed by a cat or two. Let's talk about beds, or rather, the humble sleeping spots most people used. These pallets, as they were called, weren't luxurious, but they offered insulation and rest, even if they also hosted the occasional insect or field mouse. Linens were rare. Most people slept in their clothes. Pajamas didn't really exist, and personal space wasn't much of a concern either. Of course, the wealthy had options: carved wooden beds, soft feather mattresses, embroidered sheets, and thick canopies. For most, though, a bed wasn't about luxury. The nightcap we imagine today as a cozy drink was, back then, an actual hat, worn to bed, long and a bit silly looking, but perfectly practical. So people wore caps made from wool or linen to keep the warmth in. And for many, the nightcap signaled bedtime in more ways than one. Sleepwear was simple: loose, tunic-like shirts, not meant to be fashionable but functional. And if you were traveling, a bed to yourself was rare. People clutched their bags as pillows, or tied money to their belts under clothes. And though this might sound strange now, for many it was a step up from sleeping out under the sky, with wolves, rain, or unrest nearby. Last paragraph. In the medieval world, going to bed wasn't just about pulling up a blanket and drifting off. It was a spiritual, a nightly gamble where the stakes were your eternal soul. People didn't just sleep. They prepared for the possibility that they might not wake up. That's why bedtime prayers were so widespread. Forget lavender sprays or calming podcasts. Monks, nuns, and nervous nobles often ended their day with Compline, the final prayer service before sleep, followed by complete silence. That part was easy. Most were already cold, underfed, and just a little afraid of the dark. Medieval sleepers ended their day with confessions, psalms, and spiritual checklists, just in case their souls were called away between midnight and dawn. Others were quietly told to avoid heavy onions at dinner. Dreams could also point to hidden sins. Dreams were storytelling tools. Medieval literature used them often, with knights encountering angels or symbolic beasts whispering in rhyme. Dreams were like the medieval version of streaming content, allegorical, vivid, and often unsettling. And that meant the whole family, animals included, often slept together in the same space. Nobles didn't sleep beside livestock. It was seen as spiritual training, preparation for the soul's journey, and a denial of worldly comfort. Compared to this, a straw bed shared with a pig might seem luxurious, but they weren't immune to sharing space with lapdogs or prized animals either. Not for a drink of water or a quick scroll, but for prayer. This was standard in monasteries. The first service of the day, matins, took place in the darkest hours of the night. The bell would ring, the room would stir, and tired, silent figures would rise and shuffle off to chant in the cold by candlelight. Some dogs even had their own designated sleeping spots, sometimes in their own room. And a guilt-ridden dream about stealing bread might lead to actual confession the next day. They were reminded that angels were watching, though it felt more like divine surveillance than comfort. In short, bedtime prayer was less peaceful meditation and more last-minute damage control, a spiritual antivirus you hoped worked, even if you didn't understand it. Not all dreams were welcome. Animals were noisy, no personal space, no cushions, and no talking. Dozens of monks slept in a single dormitory, lined up like moral sardines. Beds were wooden planks, sometimes with straw. Monks wore their clothes to sleep easier than dressing for 2 prayers. There were no pillows, no curtains, and silence was strictly enforced. Moved around, and weren't always respectful of personal space. But people adapted. A kick from a goat at midnight was part of the nightly routine. The church warned that some were sent by demons to lead the faithful astray. If your dreams turned dark, you might be told your soul was under attack, or that you slept too close to the fireplace again. The thinking was simple. Death could come at any time, from illness, fire, demons, or the most common threat of all. But in the Middle Ages, it was survival. Medieval homes were drafty, cold, and poorly insulated. So animals became nighttime heaters. Chickens, pigs, dogs, they all nestled in with humans for warmth. A dog at your feet could keep your toes from freezing, and a cow in the room might raise the temperature just enough to matter, simply being over 30 in the year 1247. So, prayers were offered not for comfort, but for protection. One popular version, "If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take," reads sweet now, but it was essentially a spiritual will written by a child. Adults had a library of bedtime prayers, one for guilt, one for temptation, one for plagues, and sometimes one just in case something was lurking in the rafters. People even prayed to particular saints, known to watch over sleepers, sort of like holy bouncers, keeping your soul safe through the night. Children were taught to pray too, partly for their souls, and partly to keep them from asking why the family dog was in bed again. Dreams, too, held deeper meaning. While today we brush off strange dreams as stress or indigestion, medieval people believed they were messages from God, the saints, or perhaps darker forces. A dream of fire might signal hell, one of water, cleansing, or danger. And a dream involving a goat-headed man juggling fish? Time to alert a priest. Anything odd might be a divine sign or a demonic trick, and either way, it had to be taken seriously. Sleeping monks and nuns recorded their dreams and shared them with spiritual advisors. Some were praised for receiving holy visions. Beyond religious meaning, of course, sharing a bed with pets is normal now. Most homes had one room for everything. It wasn't ideal. Now imagine a medieval monastery. Some monks even slept sitting up to avoid the comfort of lying down. Which brings us to one of the more jarring routines. Waking up on purpose at 2 a.m. A nightly gamble where the stakes were your eternal soul. People didn't just sleep, they prepared for the possibility that they might not wake up. Pajamas weren't a part of their world. The only layering they prioritized was spiritual. Inside the cold, echoing chapel lit only by flickering candlelight, they recited psalms and scriptures, doing their best to stay awake. In the medieval world, it raised eyebrows. Beds were cold and warmth was a communal effort. Families, guests, even neighbors shared sleep spaces, not out of intimacy, but necessity. There were also spiritual reasons. Lying down too flat resembled the posture of the dead, and that was believed to attract unwanted attention from spirits, or even confuse divine forces. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs were an inescapable part of the experience. Hygiene was minimal, beds were often shared, and the idea of pest control involved strong herbs, ashes, or garlic solutions that did little for bugs, and even less for romance. Even nobles had living nitpickers, servants tasked with grooming their employers of parasites. Nightwear often doubled as a barrier against bites. Poems about fleas were common, some moral, some oddly romantic. Nobles sometimes used large bolsters to sleep propped up. Monks in stricter communities might sleep against walls or sit upright on benches, minimizing comfort as a form of discipline. Comfort wasn't the goal. Surviving until morning was. It wasn't common practice, but when danger loomed, even rest became tactical. Beyond warmth, there was a spiritual logic too. It was widely believed that night was the devil's prime working hours. Being alone left your soul vulnerable. Sleeping with others created a moral safety net, someone to witness anything unusual, or at the very least, share in the discomfort. Falling asleep mid-service wasn't uncommon, and it often meant extra chores or the dreaded assignment of leading the next session. Not for a drink of water or a quick scroll, but for prayer. This was standard in monasteries. The first service of the day, matins, took place in the darkest hours of the night. The bell would ring, the room would stir, and tired, silent figures would rise and shuffle off to chant in the cold by candlelight. These services, called matins, could stretch for an hour or more. Some monastic orders even extended them to 2, demanding focus and reverence, while hunger and fatigue tugged at every edge of consciousness. That's why bedtime prayers were so widespread. Forget lavender sprays or calming podcasts. In stricter houses, however, The day began immediately with study or manual labor. This early rising was symbolic as sacrifice of warmth and comfort to offer the first part of the night to God, away from worldly distractions and closer to spiritual discipline. Thales warned against sleeping in solitude, suggesting it could lead to fairy abductions or demonic mischief. Even couples were rarely alone, often joined in bed by children or servants. In monasteries, communal sleeping was the norm. Solitary sleep, if assigned, could be a punishment, a reminder that isolation made temptation easier. Medieval sleepers ended their day with confessions, psalms, and spiritual checklists, just in case their souls were called away between midnight and dawn. Monks would quietly shuffle off to the chapel in silence, still wrapped in their day clothes. After matins, monks in less strict orders would return to their beds for a second round of sleep. Today, sleeping alone is often seen as restful or luxurious. Children never slept alone, surrounded instead by siblings, parents, and sometimes livestock. Some medieval people even chose to sleep sitting up. This was partly due to medical theories that lying flat could cause poor digestion or unbalance the body's humors. And then there were the pests. Sleep in the Middle Ages was rarely restful. In some extreme cases, people even slept in armor. Knights on campaign or in siege situations would sleep with swords nearby, wearing partial armor for safety. Which brings us to one of the more jarring routines: waking up on purpose at 2 unman. If the enemy breached the walls well, at least you wouldn't have to get dressed. Priorities, naturally. Resting in armor wasn't what anyone would call comfortable. Iron didn't breathe, and chainmail liked to pinch at your skin, reminding you with every breath that you were not meant to dream peacefully in metal. You might have laid on a cold stone floor, the thin bedding offering little help, surrounded by the low rumble of comrades, snoring and torches crackling softly like distant whispers. Sleep, in such a world, drifted in and out like mist. Even those not in battle kept layers on during the night, in case danger visited while the stars still hung high. Some thought it was the devil's whisper guiding the body. Others said it was black bile, one of those mysterious humors they blamed for just about everything. And so they tied legs to furniture, muttered prayers over beds, and hung charms of iron above the doorways. Not just for peace, but for protection. There were bells to mark the hours, prayers to say at dawn, and again in the middle of the night. Without insulation or quiet rooms, thunder echoed across rafters and rain leaked through the roof. But people still found ways to close their eyes. Their bodies had adjusted, exhaustion becoming their lullaby. They needed to, because when your life demanded endless labor, when you woke before the sun and worked past dusk, sleep became sacred. The tolling became part of the dream world. The mind learned to blend the ringing with rest. Merchants on the road or guards in unfamiliar towns would rest in thick quilted gambesons, less for softness, more for safety. When the world was too heavy, too much grief, too much hunger, too much fear, they laid down, wrapped themselves in cloaks, and whispered themselves into dreams. Not thunder, not armor, not hunger, but something colder, invisible, the kind of fear that lingers in doorways and flickers in candlelight. There was a comfort in surrendering, if only for a few hours, to the quiet mercy of rest. A woman who mumbled to herself, a wife who skipped church, a servant from faraway lands. One confessed, and in doing so, opened the floodgates. In churches, sleepwalkers might be seen as signs from heaven or marked for cleansing, just in case. No longer just outcasts. Now it was the respected, the well-dressed, the kind. Fear doesn't discriminate when it's hungry. And this fear devoured the town. Your sleep, interrupted, might return only hours later. They believed because in a place where hardship was normal and darkness ever present, it was easier to name evil than to face uncertainty. And then, in the minister's home, 2 girls began to scream in the night. Still, In a world full of nighttime demons, crawling lice, and livestock that wandered indoors, sleep was already an uneasy companion. They still lit candles, said prayers, and closed their eyes beneath the weight of worry. Sleep, fragile though it was, remained. They twisted in unnatural ways, silent for hours, then wild with terror. People started looking sideways at one another. No fever, no injury, just ... something else. In truth, it was better than nothing, and a little padding went a long way when prayers were all that kept your eyes closed. But armor was never subtle. Turn the wrong way, and a single metal clink might startle an entire barracks. And if you sleepwalked, that wasn't just another quirk of the night. It was something far stranger. They didn't call it sleepwalking. They called it noctambulation. If you were seen wandering in the dark, vacant-eyed and silent, you might be mistaken for a spirit. Or worse, a soul claimed by unholy forces. To witness someone mumbling Latin in their sleep, stepping around chickens in a fog of dreamlike confusion, it was enough to make even the bravest cross themselves. There were tales of people climbing rooftops while still asleep, of leaping dreamers and open windows that brought too much risk. But through all this fear, sleep still came. It had to. Life didn't pause for fatigue. Storms were no different. Even war didn't stop it. Invasions, plagues, fires, earthquakes. Somehow, even as the world shook, some souls slept through it. For many, sleep became an escape. In the winter of 1692, as snow blanketed the village of Salem, fear took on a new shape. Salem was already fraying, divided by religion, worn down by sickness and war. Neighbors distrusted each other. Outsiders were watched closely. Betty and Abigail, young and suddenly strange, cried out as if haunted. The doctor found nothing physical, so he named something darker: witchcraft. That word alone changed everything. In a town shaped by sermons and scripture, where the devil was not symbolic but real, that diagnosis was like thunder in a dry forest. And the girls began to name names. At first, they pointed toward the edges, those who already stood apart. What began as a whisper became a tidal wave. Girls writhed in court, spoke of invisible spirits, cried out during prayers. And the people believed them. They believed because fear is persuasive, and sleep-deprived minds can lose their grip. Accusations spread. Yet even in this fever of suspicion, people still went to bed at night. Because even then, even in the cold heart of Salem's long night, the body still hoped for rest. It always does. She told a story of a tall man in black, a figure associated with the devil, who asked her to sign a book. She said she saw strange animals, yellow birds, red cats, and even spectral dogs. But most troubling of all, she whispered that there were other witches in Salem. And that was all the court needed to hear. When Tituba spoke those words, it was as though the locks had been unfastened on a door no one could close again. An argument over a fence, a dispute over land, a cold stare in church, these became reasons. To defend the accused was to risk joining them. And so the threads of accusation, once fine and rare, thickened and multiplied, stretching across the village like a web woven in shadow. If a cow fell ill, or a child cried during morning prayers, it must have been a curse. It had to be. One voice became two became many. Week by week, new names were spoken into still air, like ripples across a pond. Neighbors looked sideways at one another. Long-held grudges slipped quietly beneath the surface of righteous accusations. And as the air thickened with fear, silence became its own defense. Speaking out, even in compassion, became dangerous. Governor William Phipps, newly appointed and eager to show command, formed a special court. If you confessed, you might live, but only if you gave more names. The only currency left was betrayal. Crowds gathered. People came from neighboring towns to witness the spectacle. The accused, some frail, some elderly, many simply poor, were shackled and marched in, faces drawn, souls exhausted. In Salem, law had become a reflection of fear, not truth, their fate already turning like a wheel. If a suspect looked at them, they screamed. If they did not, they screamed louder. Each reaction was taken not as performance, but as proof. Among them, Martha Corey, who had dared to speak out, and her husband, Giles, and the court, held firm by men like Chief Justice William Stoughton and Judge Samuel Sewall, accepted it all. They called it the Court of Oyer and Terminer, to hear and determine. But what it became was something else entirely. And though she denied everything, her past was enough. They led her to Gallows Hill. There was no prayer, no last rites, only silence, and then the rope. At first released, she was taken again when the afflicted girls resumed their fits. In a letter to the court, she did not beg for her own life, but pleaded that the trials end so that no more innocent blood would be shed. She was hanged not long after. Reason receded. Hysteria took its place. After her mother's arrest, Dorothy was questioned, and in her fear, she said what they wanted to hear. She confessed. Imprisoned for 8 months in chains, her young mind could not recover. When she was released, she was never the same. Stone by stone, laid across his chest, slowly, unrelentingly. For 3 days, his last words, more weight. Elizabeth Proctor, wife of John Proctor, was sentenced to die, but her child spared her for a time. She gave birth in jail. Later, she was freed, not because of reason, but because the fire reached too high. Rules bent like branches in a storm. And soon, something called spectral evidence was allowed. His intelligence, his calm manner, his earlier disputes with powerful families, all of it made him suspect. And so, he too was condemned. At least 5 died waiting, unnamed, in silence. Over 200 were accused. The shadow of the gallows stretched far not only across Salem's fields, but into the hearts of every home. Still, the list of accused grew, because in Salem, it no longer mattered who you were, only who might say your name. The jury hesitated, but the pressure was too great. Her final words floated on the breeze. I am as innocent as the child unborn. They spilled into other towns. Ipswich, Boston, chained to cold stone walls. Fed rarely, forgotten often. These were not strangers. These were neighbors, parents, children, ordinary people caught in extraordinary madness. But innocence held no power. The noose held more. This meant that if a person claimed to see your spirit, your ghost-like form, in their dreams or visions, afflicting them, that was enough, even if you were at home, even if you were praying. With the panic too widespread to ignore, the colonial government took action. The courtroom was not built of justice, but fear. You cannot cross-examine a dream. And worse, you cannot disprove one. In that space, children became the loudest voices. Their seizures, their cries, their sudden fits in court became theater. No lawyers, no defense. You stood alone. If you denied the charges, they called it evidence. Soon, these trials became events. And yet, not everyone was convinced. Some whispered doubts. Some asked quiet questions. But few dared to say those thoughts aloud. To challenge the court was to challenge Providence itself. The first execution came on June 10th. Bridget Bishop, a woman known for bright colors and sharper words. She had been accused before. With her death, the wheel turned faster. 5 more women were hanged in July. Among them, Rebecca Nurse, kind, elderly, devout. In August, more died. Then came September 22nd, a day of grim record. 8 hanged in a single morning. Giles refused to enter a plea, and so, by ancient English law, they punished him by pressing. In the end, 19 people were hanged, one pressed to death. The jails, damp, foul, overcrowded, could no longer contain the accused. Some were accused for land, others for envy, some for nothing at all. Mary Easty was one of them, sister of Rebecca Nurse, a mother of 7, pious and beloved. Then there was Dorothy Good, 4 years old, the daughter of Sarah Good. Even pregnancy did not grant mercy. Others were not as lucky. Some confessed only to live another day. But those confessions bred more accusations, more names, fathers, daughters, families. The spiral deepened. Jails filled to breaking. Food ran low. Disease swept through the stones. But by the late autumn of 1692, the winds began to shift. Too many names, too many of the respected, revered. Reverend George Burroughs, a former minister, was arrested. And yet, on the day of his execution, with the noose around his neck, he stood on me. Gallows and flawlessly recited the Lord's Prayer, something witches were believed incapable of doing. The crowd fell into a stunned silence. Even those who had come expecting justice found themselves uncertain, their conviction trembling. Some wept, some looked away, but the execution went forward. The rope was pulled. The crowd, despite their doubt, did nothing. The hysteria had reached the highest step of the colonial ladder. The governor, once a supporter of the court, now saw the chaos with unclouded eyes. Public unrest was growing. Criticism buzzed in the air like flies. And so, in October of 1692, he acted. And yet, in that quiet moment, a seed of something new took root. A seed of doubt, faint but alive. And then, the accusation that changed everything. Mary Phipps, the wife of Governor William Phipps, was named. Increase Mather, one of the most respected theologians in the colony, delivered a statement that echoed like a prayer of reason through a fevered land. It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than one innocent person should be condemned. People who had once confessed began to recant, admitting what everyone feared: they had lied, out of desperation, out of fear, because of pain. How could a man so devout, so trusted, be accused? It was clear. This was no longer about truth. Staring at their hands, mothers who had whispered curses behind closed doors now whispered prayers for forgiveness. The fear had not vanished. Some went home to nothing, to ruined land, to shattered families, but they went home. The family of Rebecca Nurse campaigned for her name to be cleared, and the town, once cloaked in self-righteous fury, now wore a mantle of quiet shame. The court that had swallowed the town began to collapse under its own weight, but it had worn itself out. The frenzy had burned so hot, it could burn no longer. A line had been crossed, a wound left open. It was a dangerous, radical thing to say, but it marked a turning point, and more than 200 stood accused. The courts fell apart under the weight of what they had done. One, Ann Putnam Jr., returned to her church in 1706, and before a hushed congregation, asked forgiveness. She blamed her actions on Satan, but many wondered if guilt alone had twisted her soul. For others, no apology could undo what had been done. A crater of silence remained where justice had once lived. In 1697, he stood in church during service, head bowed, as a minister read aloud his confession of guilt. His voice didn't rise to defend himself. He simply stood and listened. The court of Oyer and Terminer was dissolved. The trials paused. The executions stopped. The winds were shifting. The survivors, both the freed and the mourners, tried to piece together what was left. But how do you rebuild trust in a town where every accusation felt like a knife? Where every whisper had the power to end a life? The Corey family, the Proctors, their grief remained uncompensated. At first, the silence was cautious. But then ministers, Many who had stood silent or encouraged the panic began to speak. Gallows Hill, where so many had died, was never formally marked. It stood quiet, untended, as if the town hoped time would bury memory. The village, weary of death and accusation, was ready to listen. But even then, freedom came with a price. Families were made to pay for their own imprisonment. Jail fees, bedding, food. The cost of survival was tallied like a debt. For some, it was the final cruelty in a long string of betrayals. In the eyes of former friends, Salem hadn't been cursed by witches. It had been cursed by fear, by pride, and by power without humility. People who had once filled the pews and cheered the executions now sat in their homes, not by witches, but by itself. By late 1692, the machine that fed on confession and panic began to stall. In its place, a new court was formed in early 1693, the Superior Court of Judicature. This one was cautious. Spectral evidence was no longer accepted. Judges, once quick to condemn, now asked questions. The mood had changed. The storm had broken. The convictions slowed. Of the dozens of cases brought before this new court, most were dismissed. The girls who had once convulsed and screamed in court now found their performances less convincing. The spell had been broken. Reverend Samuel Willard was never charged, but merely being suspected was enough to shake the remaining faith in the system. The jail doors opened slowly, one by one. First, the least incriminated, then those who had confessed under pressure. And then came the reckoning. John Proctor's children petitioned the court to return their father's property. Churches splintered. Friends no longer spoke. Salem was still standing, but it wasn't the same. Governor Phipps, feeling the heat of both local unrest and distant judgment from across the sea, pardoned the remaining prisoners. In the end, 19 were hanged, 1 crushed, 5 died in jail. Salem would never be the same. The trials ended, but peace did not return. The gallows stood still, and the prison doors groaned open, but Salem was haunted. The people who had screamed for justice now walked quietly. Some of the afflicted girls left town. Others grew up in silence. Even the judges were not untouched. Samuel Sewall, who had once sat in proud authority over the trials, did something few others dared. The echoes of that moment traveled farther than any sentence he had passed. Families of the dead sought something more. Justice. They filed petitions, demanded names be cleared, property restored, dignity returned, and slowly it came. In 1711, a bill passed in Massachusetts acknowledging the wrongful executions. Some heirs received money. Some names were restored, but not all. The shame lingered. Salem tried to hide. The village changed its name to Danvers. But memory doesn't rest easily. The trials lived on in stories and in sermons, in the spaces between sentences. The executions stopped, but the curse, the real one, would stay for generations. The gallows may be gone, the courtroom's quiet, but the warning still stands. Truth is fragile, justice is not automatic, and history has a habit of repeating itself. Unless we remember Fulvia was born around 83 BCE into the elite, yet somewhat eccentric Fulvian family, an old plebeian house that had, through ambition and maneuvering, climbed into Rome's upper ranks. Though not one of the ancient patrician lineages that traced their blood to the very founding myths of the Republic, the Fulvi had earned their place. Consuls, generals, orators, their legacy was sharp and stubborn. Her father, Marcus Fulvius Bombalio, was known more for his awkward, stammering speech than for any statesmanship. The nickname Bambalio itself meant the stammerer. But Fulvia, she was no stammer. In rooms where men argued policy and ambition over wine and scrolls, young Fulvia watched and listened. She learned how Roman power operated, not just in the forum or on the battlefield, but in private dinners, arranged marriages, and quiet vendettas. From her earliest days, she seemed born to speak with clarity, to move with intent, and to stand without flinching. They were to be polished and well-read, yet silent and obedient. Fulvia chose another path, but behind the slanted words lies a clear truth. She was involved. She took her husband's bloodied corpse and turned it into a political statement, parading it through the forum, letting the people see what had been done. The city burned with grief and rage. Riots spread. The Senate House itself was consumed by fire. She worked with Clodius, supported his populist agenda, and turned their home into a hub of political agitation. Together, they were a force, dynamic, dangerous, and disruptive. Her next marriage to Gaius Scribonius Curio was another shrewd step. When Curio died in battle in Africa, Fulvia once again bore the grief and once again refused to fade. Curio was a rising star and an ally of Julius Caesar. The match gave Fulvia renewed access to influence. Their relationship, like the one before, was built on more than affection. It was built on shared purpose. She was a political operator in her own right, the first Roman woman to appear on coinage not as a goddess, but as herself. A signal to the world that she had stepped out from behind the curtain and wasn't planning to leave. While Antony battled rivals and claimed his place in the new order, Fulvia remained in Rome, anchoring his support, navigating the volatile currents of loyalty and betrayal. She understood the pulse of Rome, the tides of public favor, the intricacies of Senate debates, the shadows where real influence moved. She would never be content to simply stand beside powerful men. She would match them, maneuver them, even outpace them. She grew up in a home steeped in politics, where alliances rose and fell with every letter and every whispered conversation. Women in her position were expected to support from the sidelines. She was educated, yes, but also ambitious. Their marriage was not only personal, but strategic. She handled his correspondence, advised his allies, managed affairs in the capital. Roman men recoiled. A woman wielding such public influence? It defied everything they thought sacred. But Fulvia had always known that power was not given. It was taken and kept. It was a political alliance of radical energy. Clodius was a firebrand, adored by the urban poor and despised by the conservative elite. He was charismatic, theatrical, and utterly volatile. Rome, meanwhile, was not a city at peace. The Republic was fraying. The streets whispered of civil war. Generals raised private armies. The Senate grew paranoid. And into this rising storm stepped Fulvia. Her first marriage, to Publius Clodius Pulcher, was more than a union of households. And Fulvia was no quiet bride. Roman accounts, filtered through the sneers of male chroniclers, paint her as bold, even brazen. When Clodius was murdered in a clash with a rival's guards, Fulvia did not retreat into mourning. It was Fulvia's first great act of public defiance, and Rome remembered. But in a city where power could vanish overnight, Fulvia did not linger in widowhood. She kept the political machine alive, rallying the base Clodius had once commanded, maintaining their voice in Rome, even as Caesar and Pompey edged toward civil war. Her third and final marriage was to none other than Mark Antony. Antony, soldier, statesman, and in many eyes, Caesar's true heir. He needed Rome. Fulvia held Rome. Fulvia became a partner not just in name, but in governance. After Caesar's assassination, chaos returned. She was not always loved. She was often feared, and she was never ignored. Fulvia was more than the wife of 3 powerful men. Rome was not ready for Fulvia, but Fulvia was ready for Rome. The gallows may be gone, the courtroom's quiet, but the warning still stands. But were these accusations fair? Hardly. Fulvia had operated within a political climate where violence and manipulation were not only accepted, they were expected, at least if you were a man. In a world where ambition was currency and betrayal a common language, Fulvia simply played by the same rules. What made her scandalous was not what she did. She didn't rule from behind curtains or whisper from the wings. She gave speeches. She made decisions. She issued commands. And for that, history chose to mock her, to warn against her, to erase her. But who she was while doing it. A woman, visible, vocal, commanding. Mark Antony's later downfall, so often blamed on Cleopatra, had echoes of Fulvia's earlier defiance, except Cleopatra is remembered as an enchantress, while Fulvia is barely remembered at all. Her enemies saw in her not just a rival, but a disruption of Rome's deeply gendered order. But the truth, like a stubborn thread pulled through time, is harder to silence. Fulvia was no mere political wife. She was a strategist, a commander, a stateswoman. In a republic collapsing under the weight of ego and civil war, she was one of the few who tried to hold the center, not with compromise, but with conviction. Even in exile, even in death, she loomed large. And yet her legacy was profound. She set a precedent not just for Roman women, but for all those who would refuse the quiet roles history tries to assign. She stood in the face of ridicule, betrayal, and exile. She stood for ideals, for legacy, for power. And in doing so, she lit a path, brief, defiant, unforgettable. Her presence on coinage marked her as something extraordinary, not a goddess or allegory, but Fulvia, a mortal woman wielding real authority. But for those who look closer, who pause amid the noise of conquest and empire, Fulvia's story endures like an ember beneath the ash. And she paid the price. Her story faded into footnotes, her name spoken only when blame needed a target. She had tried to govern Rome when Rome was ungovernable. She had defended her family when others fled. She had dared to challenge a future emperor. And though her monuments crumbled and her victories were buried, one truth remains. Fulvia stood. She stood in a world not made for her. Even as the sun set behind the Washington Monument and the last buses rolled away from the Capitol, the march on Washington did not truly end. It settled, instead, into memory, into hearts, into history. The signs were packed away. The feet that had marched were rested. But the echoes, the voices, the chants, the dreams, they lingered. Not loud, not forceful, just present, like a distant song remembered in the quiet of night. The march was over, but the movement was not. In the years that followed, the struggle continued. In courtrooms, on bridge crossings, in city halls and schoolyards. And yet, something was different. What courage could be when it stood still and spoke softly. Because now, the world had seen what dignity looked like. A kind of moral clarity, calm, patient, but unstoppable, had made itself known. What a dream sounded like when it left the lips of a preacher and wrapped itself around a nation's soul. There were still battles ahead. Bloody Sundays, lost lives, long roads. But in that August heat, a light had been lit. And though it would flicker at times, though doubt and fear and hatred would try to smother it, the light would never go out. Because it had been seen, not in shouting, not in violence, but in harmony, in the stillness of a crowd listening, in the gentle sway of gospel songs drifting across the water, in the heartbeat of 250,000 souls who had come not for war, but for peace, not for spectacle, but for something sacred. They had marched for freedom, and in doing so, they became free, if only for a day, if only in spirit. And that was enough to begin again. The march on Washington ended not with fireworks or fanfare, but with footsteps fading into the dusk. Quiet, slow, steady, each one leaving behind a trail. Not just on the National Mall, but across the map of a country still learning how to be just. And even now, if you listen carefully, beneath the noise of today, beyond the pages of textbooks and the sound bites of speeches, you can still hear them. The footsteps, the songs, the dream, still walking, still singing, still waiting, still rising, and like all dreams worth having, still not done.